Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to be talking about the new weapons that just got announced in KMS and how they're going to affect the best in slot structure for regular servers in GMS. If you haven't been following the news, KMS just announced the new Genesis weapons, which you can get from the Black Mage, and they're significantly stronger than the Arcane weapons, and also they function a little bit differently than any other weapon in the game. um, for a couple of reasons that I will discuss more in detail later on. But first, I'm going to go ahead and get started here with the clean item stats. So this chart is basically just the clean stats of all the items I'm going to be talking about today. We have the CRA hat, we have the Arcane hat, Arcane cape, Arcane glove, Arcane shoe, Arcane shoulder, Arcane knuckle. I'm using knuckles here obviously because I'm an arc, but you can substitute your own weapon values and do the math yourself for that. Genesis knuckle, and then I also have the Sweetwater set here. These aren't best in slot, but I just want to have them here for the sake of comparison because I and many other people also have a transpose set at the moment, so just to see the difference after we get the new weapon, I think that would be useful. Over here in this chart I have the flame stats. For boss items, I'm assuming that you have 2 lines of tier 6 flame. That would be 1 line of single stat and 1 line of percent stat. I'm using percent stat instead of a double stat line because percent stat is actually a little bit more valuable in regular servers now. Reason being that after we got the 25-star system, everyone got a huge boost of regular stat, and so in comparison to regular stat, percent stat is more valuable now. So that's why I have that there. Shoulders obviously don't have flames. For weapons, I actually assume that you have 4 lines of tier 6, which might not be realistic, but just for the sake of comparison, that's what I'm using. And then for the Sweetwater stuff, because they aren't considered to be boss items, I only have 1 line of tier 5 for the flames, and again, I'm assuming that you have 1 line of tier 5 in percent stat, rather than single stat. So those are the assumptions there. Moving on to scrolled stats. Basically, if an item could be primed here, I assume that you primed it. So, CRA hat, Arcane cape, glove, shoe, all primed. You can't prime shoulders, so I assume that you used Chaos of Goodness and you got 5 attack on every slot, and that you got 0 stat, which again might not be realistic, but that's just what I'm using. Arcane Knuckle, I'm assuming you primed it. And then Genesis Knuckle, you actually can't scroll. So Genesis Knuckle doesn't work like other weapons. Basically it works like not exactly like, but similar to the Cursed Kaiserium that Hard Magnus drops on occasion. You essentially, when you get the weapon, it's like quote-unquote dormant, and you have to do quests to unlock its true potential, basically. You can still cube it as normal, but you can't scroll it and you can't enhance it. It does that itself. So once you complete a certain number of quests, it will just give itself +8 of 15% traces, and that value is 32 stat and 72 attack. It only does +8 because that's the clean number of slots, and you obviously can't hammer it, so that's just how it is. So that's how I got that value there. Sweetwater hat, I'm assuming that you transposed an Aquarius crown, which has 24 slots after you hammer it, so that's 240 stat there. For the Sweetwater stuff here, I'm assuming that you transposed 15-star Tyrants and that you primed all of the scroll slots. So these stat values include both the stat gain from 15-starring a Tyrant and also the stat gain from priming the slots on the item. Cape has 2 less slots than Glove and Shoe, so that's why there's 20 less here. And then 150 attack is the amount of attack you get for 15-starring a Tyrant item. So that's how I got those. The game actually treats these as if they are scrolled stats after you transpose, so that's why I'm doing it this way rather than having these down in the Star Force section, because this is how the game actually functions. So with that said, moving on to the Star Force section, again, I'm assuming that if an item can be 22 starred, you 22 star it. So CRA hat, Arcane hat, cape, glove, shoe, shoulder, knuckle. The Genesis Knuckle will 22 star itself after you complete a certain amount of quests which is nice because you don't actually have to spend time and money blowing it up over and over. Hat, 22 stars. Now, glove, shoe, and cape get capped at 15 because GMS said so. So you only actually gain 1 star because you lose 1 from transposing. So you get the value of 14 to 15 on a regular item. For gloves, that is 3 stat and 1 attack. For a shoe and a cape, that is just 3 stat. So that's how I got those. One thing to note here, the first 15 stars on weapons work a little bit differently in GMS than they do in KMS. I refer to it basically as like a tiered attack system. So depending on how much attack your weapon has, the first 15 stars will give it a specific amount. So if I have between 1 and 50 attack, a star will give me 1 additional attack. If I have between 51 and 100, it will give me 2. If I have between 101 and 150, it will give me 3, so on and so forth. You get the idea. Basically, every 50 attack that your weapon has, the value of a single star increases by 1. So using that logic, I have kind of like a flowchart out here, basically just calculating how much attack you would end up gaining. So these starting values are after you scroll them, and then just following the logic until the end, and then I just use the difference between the 15 star result and the starting result to get how much that adds. Every star past 15 just works the same way it does on armor, so these are the only ones that are special basically, and that's how I calculated them. So that's how I ended up with these values here, and that's pretty much everything for the Star Force stats. I'm not going to read through all this, you can read through it if you would like. Set effects. So these are the relevant set effects that I'm going to be talking about at the end. We have 2 set CRA, we have 4 set CRA, we have 2 set Arcane, 5 set Arcane, 6 set Arcane, 4 set Sweetwater, and 5 set Sweetwater. So the reason that I have multiple, like a ton of different options of each set here, is because the Genesis Knuckle actually functions as a lucky item. So as long as you have at least 3 equips from any given set, the Knuckle will fill in one of the effects for that set. So if I have 3 Arcane items and I have 3 Sweetwater items, the Knuckle will fill both a Sweetwater set and an Arcane set, which is pretty crazy. And that's also why we're even considering CRA here, because as you'll see later, there's some interesting implications of having a lucky weapon. Moving on to the totals per item. So this doesn't include any set effects, this is just each item. This is the clean stats, the scrolled stats, the enhancement stats, and the flame stats. And you end up with these totals. Again, I'm not going to read through all of this because it would take a long time. If you're interested, you can just read through these yourself, or for weapons specifically, you're probably going to have to calculate your own weapon, which you can do basically following the same steps I did above. Now, with that all out of the way, we can talk about the setups. So, I have 6 scenarios here. I have them labeled 1 through 6, and basically these are just various different options for your equip setup and what the implications are after we get Genesis weapons. So to start off with, we have 2 set CRA, which is just your top and bottom. We have 5 set Arcane, which is hat, cape, glove, shoe, and shoulder. And then we have the Arcane weapon. So set effects here, you have 2 set CRA, and then you have 6 set Arcane. And you end up with a total of 1,949 stat, 1,413 attack, 30% stat from your flames, 72 boss. You have 42 on the knuckle from the clean 30, the 12 from the flame, and then you also have 30 boss from the Arcane set, so you get 72. And then you have 38.8 ignore defense. So I actually calculated out what the IED would actually be here. In the past, I've just had like an added version, which isn't accurate, obviously, but I was just too lazy to do the actual calculation. But I want to be kind of accurate here, so you have 3 sources of ignore defense. You have 20% on the knuckle, which just comes passively. You have the 15% on the Arcane hat, and you have the 10% from the Arcane set. And if you do the math, you end up with 38.8. And then finally we have 6% damage, which is just the flame. Now, if we replace the Arcane weapon with a finished Genesis weapon, we basically just gain the difference between the two weapons, which is a decent amount of stat and a decent amount of attack. So we gain 2001, or not, we don't gain that much, that would be crazy. We have a total of 2001 stat, we have a total of 1,523 attack, we have a total of 30% stat, 72 boss, 38.8 ignore defense, and 6% damage. None of these actually change because the only thing that increases is the base value of the weapon. Now, once we have a Genesis weapon, we can actually do something pretty interesting. We can replace our Arcane hat in this scenario with a CRA hat. We obviously lose a lot of stat and attack by going backwards here, and we lose a little bit of ignore defense as well, but we gain the third set of the CRA effect, which is 50 attack, and then because we now have 3 pieces of CRA, the Genesis weapon will count in the CRA set, giving us the 4th set effect. So as a result, we end up with 1,930 stat. We lose a decent amount there. We lose a tiny bit of attack because of the attack loss here. And we also lose the 6th set of the Arcane, which is 30 attack. We go from 6 to 5. So that's why we end up losing a little bit of attack. We keep the same amount of percent stat. We gain 30 boss damage because of the 4th set CRA, which is huge. And we lose a little bit ignore defense because the natural ignore defense on the hats gets a little bit worse. We keep the same damage. So this is actually your best option if you have an Arcane set and you're getting a Genesis weapon. You will want to replace your hat with CRA. You lose some stat, but it's more than made up for by the boss gain, even though you also lose a little bit of ignore defense. 30 boss is just a lot. So it's pretty interesting that we're moving backwards. Well, I mean, maybe not in your perspective, but CRA technically is supposed to be worse than Arcane. However, because of the implications of the Genesis weapon, it actually becomes best in slot again, which I think is pretty funny. You can see out to the side here I have rankings, and I'll talk about this more after I go over the rest of the sets, but this is actually the #1 option. This is basically the best in slot. So I'm going to quickly go over the Sweetwater stuff. Currently you can get 2-set CRA, which is just your top and bottom again. You can get 4-set Sweetwater, which is just all of these Sweetwater items. And you have 1 Arcane item here, that's the shoulder. Then you're using the Arcane weapon. So this is what a lot of people have currently, minus the shoulder because people haven't cleared Will enough yet. Although next week, you know, we'll have that. But you end up with a total of 1,719 stat, 1,491 attack, 26% stat, 42 boss because you don't have a set effect that gives boss, you only have the boss from the weapon. 20 ignore defense because your hat does not give ignore defense, and you also don't have a set that gives ignore defense. And 6 damage, which is just the flame on your weapon. Now, again, we'll replace that with a Genesis weapon. One thing to note here is that since we do not have 3 pieces of Arcane, the Genesis weapon will only fill the Sweetwater set, and the 5th set effect for Sweetwater is only 100 defense, so it's basically worthless. So we lose the 2nd set of Arcane here, and we don't really gain anything in return. So the gains here are worse than the gains here, but we end up with a total of 1,771 stat, 1,571 attack, 26% stat, 42 boss, 20 ID, and 6 damage. Now again, once we're at this point, it still is in our best favor to trade out our Sweetwater hat for a CRA hat. And actually, the difference between a Sweetwater hat and a CRA hat is smaller than the difference between an Arcane and CRA, so we make up a bit of ground here on the Arcane set. We end up with a total of 1,699 stat, 1,616 attack, 26% stat, 72 boss, because we actually get the 4th set of CRA, which gives us another 30, and 28 ignore defense, because the CRA hat has 10 passively, and 6 damage. So the reason that this jump is bigger than this jump is a couple of different things. The first being, like I said, the Sweetwater hat is obviously worse than the Arcane hat here, and so you lose less by downgrading. But also, because we don't have an Arcane set, or rather, sorry, because the 5th set of Sweetwater and the 4th set of Sweetwater are identical, basically, we don't actually lose anything by trading away a Sweetwater item. We keep essentially the same set effect. So this is just like a much better upgrade than it is going from here to here, which is interesting. And now I'm going to cover the rankings a little bit. So like I said, this is still obviously the number 1 option. Technically the number 2 option is right here. You gain a hell of a lot more stat than you do over this option, but you lose about like 80-ish attack. You have more percent stat, obviously. You have the same amount of boss. You have a lot more, not a lot more, but 10 more ignore defense and 6% damage. So this is still technically better than this. But the caveat there is that you would actually never be here, more likely than not, because it's just always in your best interest to go from this to this. So if you're here, if you have the Genesis weapon, which is the hard one to get, then there's no reason to not go to a CRA hat, because those are pretty common and not that hard to find, basically. So you would never actually be in this position. You would also never actually be in this position. You would always either be in 1, 3, 4, or 6. But for the sake of ranking them, this is technically still better. And then in 3rd, we have the 6th scenario. So it's still worse than an Arcane set, obviously, to have a transposed Sweetwater set. But once we cover the differences here, you'll see that we actually make up a little bit of ground because of the interactions happening here. So basically, next to all of these, just to make it easy for people to follow, I have what scenario is being subtracted from which. So up here I have them numbered. This difference right here is scenario 1, this one, minus scenario 4, which is this one. And these are the results. So you end up with a surplus of 230 stat, a loss of 78 attack, a gain of 4% stat, gain of 30 boss, gain of 18.8 ignore defense. When we move to Genesis weapon, the difference between Arcane and Sweetwater actually gets bigger. Arcane gets even better if we don't have a CRA hat, because we gain... Wait, no, we lose the 2-set Arcane effect in this, and so we lose the 30 attack there. But then if we go to Genesis plus CRA, Sweetwater actually gets not better than Arcane, but better compared to where it is currently, just because we don't lose a set effect from our Sweetwater by swapping out to CRA, basically. And we also make up some of the IED difference. So this is still... Sweetwater is obviously still worse, because 30 boss is just really significant, and the stat gain between these basically makes up for the attack loss. But it's interesting to see that we're actually making up some ground. Like the gap closes a little bit as a result of the interactions between the Genesis weapon and the different sets. Now, moving on from Arcane versus Sweetwater, we have just Arcane set comparisons. So, assuming that you already have an Arcane set, this is just comparing all the different scenarios here. We have Genesis and CRA minus just the Arcane weapon. You end up with, you lose some stat, but you gain a hell of a lot of attack, you gain 30 boss, and you lose a little bit of ignore defense. Then we compare Genesis with no CRA hat, to just the arcane weapon. You actually just gain stat and you gain attack, but you don't get the 30 boss, which is huge, so this is obviously not a good option right here. And then finally we have the Genesis with CRA versus Genesis without CRA, assuming that you have an arcane set. You lose stat and attack, but you gain 30 boss, and you lose a little bit of ignore defense. But the 30 boss definitely makes up for all of this loss. So it still is definitely better to have the CRA hat here. Then we do the same exact comparison for the Sweetwater set. We have the Genesis plus CRA minus just the arcane weapon. We lose some stat, we gain a lot of attack, we gain boss because the CRA set, and we gain ignore defense because the CRA hat actually has ignore defense on it. And we have Genesis with no CRA versus just the arcane weapon. We gain some stat, we gain less attack than up here, and we don't gain any boss or ignore defense. And then finally we have Genesis plus CRA versus Genesis with no CRA. We lose the most stat of any, we gain the least attack of any, but we also gain 30 boss and 8 ignore defense. So Genesis plus CRA is definitely the way to go, and that brings me to the major takeaways. First off, Genesis weapon is always worth using over arcane weapon. Now, there's a caveat here. You can't skip an arcane weapon because the requirements to get a Genesis weapon are really, really, really difficult. You have to be able to clear True Hilla, Black Mage, and then do a lot of the quests after the fact, and you're not going to be doing that without an arcane weapon. So you can't skip an arcane weapon. But once you get a Genesis weapon, it is definitely worth upgrading and using to replace your arcane weapon. Second takeaway, once you have the Genesis weapon, it is always worth replacing your hat with CRA. Regardless of what other sets you have, whether it's Sweetwater or whether it's Arcane, you will want to replace your hat with a CRA hat, just to get the double benefit there. And then finally, the gap between Transposed Sweetwater and Arcane decreases slightly because the gap between a Sweetwater hat and CRA hat is smaller than the gap between an Arcane hat and a CRA hat. And you also don't lose much, well, you don't lose anything from the set effect of Sweetwater as a result of dropping back down to a CRA hat. So yeah, that's pretty much everything. This has been a decently long video. Didn't really want to go on this long, but I had a lot to cover, I guess, so there you go. I just think it's interesting that CRA hat once again becomes relevant as a result of Genesis weapon, but again, Genesis weapon, getting one is actually extremely hard, and very few people are going to be able to do so. So this is more of just like a theory thing than a realistic thing, because it's going to be a long time before anyone actually has a Genesis weapon. So that's it from me. If you guys have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I will see you guys next time.